Hey guys, welcome back to How to Roll Dice. I'm Josh, and today we're going to be doing a review and walkthrough of this game here, Stellar by Renegade Game Studios. Stellar is a great card game for two players that sees you and your opponent attempting to calibrate your telescopes while observing various celestial objects in the night sky, and at the end of the 12-round game, whoever has done that more successfully wins. It's a very straightforward game, but it's got a semi-complex scoring system at the end of the game that makes it sort of passively competitive. You can't really tell whether or not you're doing well, let alone winning over your opponent, until you actually get to the end of the game and calculate your score, or at least I don't have the brain capacity to be able to do that on the fly, and you'll see why that is when I get into how the game actually scores. But first, let's take a deeper look at what comes in the box here. You get quite a few cards, you get a score pad, and you get the rulebook, which is pretty short and brief. The cards are broken up into a few separate categories. You've got two reference cards here. They have the turn sequence on one side and the final scoring on the other side. Obviously, just for a quick glance if you want to get the rules on the fly. You've got this deck of cards here. These are the celestial object cards. These are the cards that you're going to be acquiring and playing both onto your telescope and into your notebook as you play through the game, and I'll get into that once we go into gameplay. You've got these 5 cards here that are simply numbered 1 through 5. They sort of lay out next to the celestial object deck and let you know where to place cards to sort of create the card purchasing row, if you could call it that. You've got these pink and blue cards here. These are two separate sets that sort of turn into the same thing. When you flip them over and lay them out in the correct orientation, they actually create the player boards. These 12 cards sort of lay out in this telescope shape and create this beautiful image of a young person calibrating a telescope while looking up at the night sky. And that's where you're going to play your celestial object cards. And then you've got the rulebook, like I said, very short and sweet. It's only about 6 to 7 pages, easy to get through, not a very complex game. And then the scoring pad here, which I like because not only is it easy to use and makes the final scoring simple, but every single sheet is double-sided, so it actually kind of counts for more than it looks. A lot of use out of that. Getting into actual gameplay, starting with setup. You're going to go through the Celestial Objects deck and find I believe it's 5 cards that have a small white diamond in the bottom right corner. Those are the starting cards. You're going to shuffle those 5 cards and deal 2 to each player, discarding the 5th card that's not going to be used. Each of the players is going to take one of those 2 cards and place it onto the telescope that they've laid out in front of them using their 12 telescope cards. They can place it anywhere they like, because when placing a card on your telescope, it only has a sort of set position if there is already a card of that type on your telescope. So getting into that briefly, there are 6 different types of celestial objects. There are moons, planets, interstellar clouds, asteroids, and black holes. There are also satellite cards, which technically don't count as a type of their own, but they're a bit of a wild card. So when placing this starting card, because you don't have any cards on your telescope yet, you can place it anywhere you like. Placement does matter, but I'll sort of get into that when we get into final game scoring. So you place one of your 2 starting cards onto your telescope, as does your opponent, and then you place your other card into your notebook section. Your notebook section is actually going to be several rows of cards that you place below or beside your telescope. At the end of the game, you're actually going to have 5 stacks of cards below your telescope, as well as 12 separate cards on your telescope. And again, those stacks are going to represent the 5 different types of celestial objects: asteroids, moons, planets, black holes, and interstellar clouds. Again, satellites don't form their own stack of cards in your notebook, but they can be positioned in other stacks as sort of filler wild cards. So that's your starting 2 cards. Then each player is going to be dealt 2 cards from the Celestial Object deck, which you'll have already shuffled. And then you are going to take the top 5 cards of the Celestial Object deck and place them onto the 1 through 5 cards, which will be laid out next to the Celestial Object deck. Those are sort of just placeholder cards. And so once you have those 5 cards laid out, each player has their 2-card hand, you've placed 1 starting card onto your telescope and 1 starting card into your notebook, you're ready to begin the game. The rules don't specify which player goes first. There's no the last player to calibrate a telescope, or the youngest player, or the oldest player. None of that's included. It just says choose a starting player. On the starting player's turn, they're going to do 4 things in this specific order. They're first going to choose 1 card from the 5 cards that are laid face up next to the Celestial Object deck, and they're going to add it to their hand. Then, they're going to take 1 card from their hand, and they're going to play it either to their telescope or to their notebook. If they play it to their telescope, if they already have a card of that type, in their telescope, it has to be placed such that one edge of that card is adjacent to one of the edges of the card with the existing type that's already in there. If there aren't any cards of that matching type in your telescope, you can play it wherever you like. If you place it into your notebook, you're simply going to add it to the stack for that type of card. If you don't yet have a stack for that type of card, say for example you're playing a moon into your notebook and you don't yet have a moon stack, then you're going to simply create a new one by placing it beside the stacks that you already have. When you place a card into a stack, you're going to place it so that your stack is ordered numerically. So 1, 2, 3 in numerical order. If you already have a 1 and a 3 and you're playing a 5, put it at the top. If you're playing a 1 into a stack that already has a 3 and a 5, you place it at the bottom. Cards are numbered 1 through 5, and there are a few cards, I believe 1 per card type, that is numbered 6/0. When you play that into a notebook, it can count as a 6 or a 0, and you actually don't have to choose until the end of the game when scoring is happening. If you play that 0/6 card onto your telescope, it always counts as a 6. And similarly, like I mentioned with satellites, when placing those into your stacks, you can place it into any of your stacks, but you're still going to position it numerically in that stack where it makes the most sense. Also, you can move satellites around in your stack throughout the game in between stacks until it comes time for scoring, and then you sort of have to choose its final resting position. So, after you've played a card from your hand onto either your telescope or into your notebook, you're then going to choose the card from the row of 5 cards beside the celestial object deck from the position that matches the number on the card you just played. So if you played a 3 onto your telescope, you're going to look over to the cards laid out beside the celestial object deck, and you're going to take the card in the number 3 position. And whatever card you take from that row, you're now going to play directly into whichever place you didn't play a card in the previous step. So if during the play a card from your hand step, you played a card onto your telescope, and say you played a 3, and then you go and grab the 3 from the row of cards beside the deck, you're going to place that 3 directly into your notebook, into whatever stack that it belongs in, because your first play went into your telescope, so your second play must go into your notebook. Every turn you're going to add 1 card to your notebook and 1 card to your telescope. If your play from your hand went into your notebook, same deal. Say you played a 1 from your hand into your notebook, then you're going to grab the card from the 1 position beside the deck, and you're going to play it directly to your telescope. So it's always 1 card to each. The very last thing that you're going to do during your turn is you're going to backfill those empty spaces that you've created in the row of cards beside the deck. So you're simply going to take cards off the top of the deck and place them into those empty slots so that when your opponent begins their turn, they have all 5 cards to choose from. Now, there are a couple important things here. First off, say for example you take, during the gain a card to your hand, the first step of your turn, say you take the card from the number 1 position, and say that happens to be, or then say during your second step, you play a card that is number 1. Doesn't matter where you play it, telescope or notebook, but say you play a card that's number 1. That would mean during step 3, you're supposed to pull the card from the number 1 position, which is now empty because you already pulled it. All you do to resolve that is pull a card from the top of the deck, and that's your draw card that you have to play onto whichever position you haven't already placed a card in this turn. Similarly, if you play a card that has a 0/6, obviously there is no position 0 or 6 in the row of cards, so you're simply going to play the card directly off of the top of the deck. And then when you get to the point where you backfill in either of those cases, you'll only be backfilling 1 card as opposed to 2, because there'll only be 1 empty space. But there's always going to be at least 1 empty space. The one other interesting caveat, and I had trouble trying to remember this because the rule seems so random, is that if the card you choose out of the row when gaining a card as the first step of your turn is a satellite, your opponent, prior to you backfilling empty spaces at the end of your turn, can choose to wipe out all remaining cards in the row and add 5 new cards. I'm not sure why that is. I'm assuming it's because satellites are technically wild cards, so they're a little more versatile and advantageous. If you pull one, your opponent gets sort of a balancing factor, which is they get to reset the whole row of cards before their next turn begins. That's one that I don't think we've used at all in any of the games that I've played, but just throwing it out there. It's in the rules, you can do it. So, you go back and forth from you to your opponents, and every turn, like I said, playing one card to your notebook and one card to your telescope, following the rules as I've just laid out for how you can place cards on your telescope and how cards get placed in your stacks. You can shift satellites around in your stacks. You have to make sure that you match adjacent cards of like types on your telescope. One quick thing, if you ever have to place a card onto your telescope and you can't position it next to cards with a like type, say for example, you already have 2 moon cards on your telescope, but they are now surrounded by other cards that you have placed, and you're trying to play a moon card that could only possibly be placed completely on an opposite position of your telescope, not adjacent to the existing moons. You actually have to place that card face down. The downside to that is it won't be worth as many points at endgame scoring. So, once you get to having placed your 12th card onto your telescope, which means there will be no remaining spaces, and your 12th card into your notebook, and your opponent has done the same, the game ends. You're now going to go into the final scoring phase of the game, which, like I said, is sort of semi-complex in a way that it makes it difficult to, on the fly, calculate your score or your opponent's score, which is nice because it keeps the game sort of live and fluid. You never feel like, oh, well, I'm totally losing this one, so you don't get discouraged mid-game. It's nice. And granted, it's only a 20 to 30 minute game, but nobody likes to be discouraged partway through a game because it just makes you want to quit and start something else. So, going into scoring, there are basically 3 parts to scoring, and I'm going to go through them in the easiest to the most complicated. The easiest one is, do you have at least one of each of the 5 actual types of objects, again, excluding satellites, in your telescope? If you have at least one of each of the 5, you gain 10 points right there, for you and your opponent. So each of you is likely going to start with 10 points right off the bat. Next, we're going to go into majority comparisons. If you look at the telescope shape, it's actually broken down into 3 parts. You've got the 5 cards that make up the top, you've got the 3 cards that make up the middle, and then you've got the 4 cards that make up the bottom. So what you and your opponent are going to do now is you're going to add up the points of all of the cards. We'll start with the top section. So add up the number point, the points of each card shown by the number in the top left corner for each of the 5 cards in the top. So say those combined for 15 for you and 16 to your opponent. Your opponent wins the sort of majority competition for the top section. They gain 10 points. Then you compare the 3 cards in your middle, combining the points together to get a total, to their cards in the middle, combining their points together to get a total, and whoever has the most in that gains 10 points. So say you win that one, you gain 10 points. And then again, you compare by adding all the points on the cards in your bottom to all the points on their cards in the bottom row, and whoever wins that one gets 10 points. So a total of 30 points to be assigned there in groups of 10, 1 for the top, 1 for the middle, 1 for the bottom. Obviously, you can start to see how this comes into play when placing cards during the game. You want to keep in mind that your top, middle, and bottom are sort of equally balanced because you know there's going to be that scoring competition at the end there to see who gains those chunks of 10 points. Finally, the sort of most complicated, though not too complicated, scoring that you're going to perform is you're going to do the multiplier scoring. So you're going to look at each of the types of celestial objects, and you're going to count up the total number of stars displayed in the top right corner of the cards for that type. So for example, if we looked again at asteroids, you would compare the total, or you would combine the total number of stars amongst all the asteroid cards in your telescope. So say you had a total of 7 stars amongst all of your asteroids. Then you're going to look at your stack of asteroid cards in your notebook, and you're going to see what your longest run of consecutive numbers is. So say, for example, you had a total of 3 cards, but only 2 of them were consecutive. Your longest run in your asteroid row is 2, times the total number of stars that you have from asteroid cards on your telescope, which is 7, is a total of 14 points. So you would mark 14 points for your asteroids for this portion of the scoring. And then you go ahead and repeat that for every other type. So how many total stars on moons do you have? And what's your longest consecutive run of cards in your moon stack? What's the total number of stars you have from planets? And what's the longest consecutive run of numbers in your planet stack? Continuing that sort of combination and multiplication. So you're going to get 5 scores out of those. And then on top of that, you have your diversity bonus, which was the 10 for having one of each type in your telescope. And then if you had won any of the majority comparisons between top, middle, and bottom. And that's going to give you your final score. And whoever has the highest final score wins the game. And I believe if it's a tie, it's a tie. I don't think there's any tiebreakers. So that's the whole game. Like I said, everything up to the point of scoring is pretty straightforward. It's a little abstract to explain, so it might sound a little wordy, but it's really not. A brief breakdown, just if you feel lost at this point, is during your turn, you're going to grab one card from the row of 5 and add it to your hand. Then you're going to take any card from your hand and play it to either the telescope or the notebook. Then, based off whatever number that card shows, you're going to pull the card from the row that matches that number in position. And you're going to play it to wherever you didn't play the first card. So if the first card went to the telescope, the row pull goes to the notebook. And if the card from your hand went to the notebook, the row pull goes to the telescope. And lastly, you fill any empty spaces that are in the row so that your opponent can start their turn. That's it. The game only goes for 12 rounds because once you've gone through 12 rounds, your telescope is full. And then you go into the scoring process, which is pretty easy to get through because it's pretty clearly laid out on the scoring pad. And that's it. It's an easy game. It only takes about 20 to 30 minutes. I wish it could be for more players. I understand why it can't. I mean, it's obviously set up for 2 people. That's one of my only 2 nitpicks about the whole game is that it's a 2-person game, and I like games that involve a crowd, but I don't mind a 2-player game, and it's nice that this one is at least fast. It's not like sitting down to play a game of War Machine or Hordes or Warhammer 40k and eating 3 or 4 hours where, nobody else can be involved, and it's just those 2 people having a good time. Because this only takes 30 minutes, and that's including setup time, you can easily go through several games with multiple people and kind of just keep moving the 2 players around, and that's nice. My only other nitpick, and this is completely superficial, is when you lay your telescopes out on your average, say, 4-foot by 4-foot player table, or gaming table, they are so large that you can't sit directly across from your opponent. The way that the rules actually show you laying it out is sort of sitting offset to your opponent so that your telescopes can kind of line up beside each other and you can place your notebook stacks underneath your telescope. I find that offsetting a little annoying, but that's just kind of me. I like things to be nice and symmetrical. I like to sit directly across from my opponent, but in this case you can't. Not a huge deal, really no big deal, that's just me nitpicking. I did find that if you pull your telescope right to the edge of the table and they do the same, and instead of beneath your telescope you put your notebook beside your telescope, then you can kind of sit directly across from each other if you have just a big enough table. But other than that, there's really nothing wrong with this game. Like I said, it's easy to learn, it's quick to play, it's got a nice kind of system to it. I like that the fluidity of the gameplay doesn't get broken up by trying to understand like what the best move is. You kind of just play, and at the end you calculate, and if you won, you won. And I like that it's very visual. The images on the celestial object cards are very nice. They're not super repetitive. There is some repetition to them, but there's enough diversity amongst them, even amongst the like types. Say, for example, amongst planets, there's enough different planets to keep things interesting. And I like that they put in some extra flair that, they didn't really have to include. For example, each of the celestial object cards actually has a fun little factoid at the bottom of the card that gives you some description or details about that actual type of celestial body, whether it be a planet or an interstellar cloud or a black hole. So that's really cool. I really love the layout that the telescope cards create, that sort of diorama image that they create before you start placing celestial object cards on them. That's really nice looking. Overall, it's a good game. It's a solid game. I like it. I can see why other people have given it such rave reviews. And I'm definitely going to keep playing it. I've played it with 2 or 3 different people at this point, multiple games, obviously. And we've had a good time in each of them. I even used it to get somebody who hasn't ever played any serious games like this into playing a few. We actually played a game of this, and we played a game of Memoir 44 because I wanted to throw some diversity at them. And they really enjoyed it, so it's good for that too. It's a good learning game. But yeah, if you guys, if you get the opportunity, I would definitely recommend picking it up, if not at least playing a couple of rounds if you know somebody who owns a copy. So yeah, Stellar, solid game. I hope you guys would like this review. If you haven't yet, go down below and subscribe and set your notification bell to all so that you get notified whenever I post new videos. If you feel like leaving a like or a dislike or maybe a comment, I recommend you do so. And if you're looking for more content other than just my weekly Tuesday uploads, and they are Tuesdays now, I'm trying to stick to 7 p.m., but I might shift that around a little bit depending on my personal schedule. If you're looking for more content, I am streaming live on Twitch on Friday mornings, Saturday evenings, and Sunday mornings, playing various different games, platformers, some AAA titles, some shooters. So you might see Let's Play or live stream videos going up on Mondays or Wednesdays or Thursdays. That's just stuff that plays live over on Twitch that I'm moving over to YouTube. So if you want to join in live, check me out on Twitch. It's How to Roll Dice. Same as it is here. Same as it is on all my social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. It's all the same. But yeah, other than that, I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next one. Have a good night.